right, y'all. Welcome, welcome to this week's Griscom stream. It's feeling pretty good today. We've got a lot of positives to go through. A lot of really exciting news over the past couple of days. Not without their setbacks, but some very exciting news out of Peru and Mexico. And also, in a little bit, I'm going to be talking about the right way to think about money in politics. I think that people need to realize that money that's going into campaigns is not as much of a problem as the power that rich people have. But we'll get into that in a little bit. For folks who are just joining us for the first time, welcome. These Griscom streams are a little bit more casual, so I like to hang out and see what y'all are saying in the chat. So feel free to jump in there and ask questions or comments or things like that. These are just a little bit less, structured than the main shows that we do Thursdays at 8 Eastern, 7 Central. And also, just a quick plug for our Patreon, patreon.com/leftreckoning. There's a lot of really exciting stuff on there. We've been doing deep dives into thinkers like James Connolly and Walter Rodney, as well as just yesterday, Matt and I did our first debate recap stream where we watched Leo Panitch, one of the great socialist thinkers of our time, who unfortunately just recently passed away, debating two capitalists on the question of has socialism ever worked. It was a fun conversation, and definitely check that out if you haven't had a chance to see it. But yeah, y'all, I mean, we got some pretty great news so far out of Peru, where this, as we're still waiting for the last bits of the vote to come in, it does seem like Pedro Castillo is going to be able to walk away with a slim lead, thus ensuring his victory. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, I just wanted to take a second to celebrate a little bit. Hell yeah. Just goes to show you that sometimes, being very ambitious and bold in the way that you're trying to build coalitions, but also very clear and is very useful. He's carrying around that pencil because he promised to rewrite the Constitution. I really love it. I love I love a leftist who can dance. Pedro Castillo has run a really fascinating campaign, one that I think people in the West should really take heed of and look to for some sources of inspiration. Let's not forget what we're talking about here is a farmer, a teacher, and a union leader, somebody who is not a kind of traditional politician in that sense, who has risen to this occasion to take on one of the most reactionary organizations and groupings in Peruvian politics and also the continent, Keiko Fujimori, who, by the way, is now claiming fraud. And we are definitely seeing, a lot of sympathy towards that message from a lot of, pro-intervention Western press. So this is not a settled thing at all. And I think it's important not to take our eye off the ball yet, because these kind of things, one, can always boil over into outright coups, as we've seen, or to just enough outrest and dangerous situations for working people where they're targeted by people who have much more access to sympathetic military and security forces. So let's not take our eye off the ball of that. But it's definitely a really exciting move, and there's been the U.S. narrative about this, and we've talked about this a lot on the show. I'm happy to take general questions about that, of course. But I think it's worth noting, and just saying again, because it gets so overshadowed in the way that a lot of Americans are talking about this election, how incredible of a coalition Pedro Castillo is building in Peru. One, he is standing up for working class people in a bold way, not just saying, Joe Biden was the president from Scranton, right? Pedro Castillo is talking about working class people and bringing them into the coalition in an actual material way, targeting the forces that immiserate poor people, targeting the international systems that extract wealth and resources from Peru. Like, very much recognizing that, it's all well and good to talk about working people as like a rhetorical tool, but one, targeting the forces that make life difficult for working people, and two, bringing working people into your coalition. Remember the distinction we make sometimes between having class-focused politics and class-rooted politics. What we're seeing right now with Pedro Castillo is very, very unique, which is why some people, I think, have had a hard time wrestling with or reckoning with what's happening there. It's very unique because this isn't a campaign or a political movement that was developed in PMC circles and super urban elite circles. This was a movement that is very much rooted in working class and rural parts of the country, which I think is really important for people, especially people who want to wag their fingers in the West about this campaign, to recognize that this is what it looks like when working people come into power, when working people have access to politics. And I think that some people need to be have a little bit more self-reflection as to what that means. And too, the coalition building from Pedro Castillo and Peru Libre has been incredible as well, including bringing in a lot of other political movements and political parties that represent left-wing currents as well as important social movements. And I think that's the thing that's been so frustrating about all this discourse about Pedro Castillo is this horrible social conservative, is such a monstrous guy. It's one, this is somebody who says that on all these social questions, he thinks that the people should decide, saying that he actually wants these to be held up to nationwide votes, right? Two, is he campaigning on harming any communities or taking rights away from any communities? No. This is somebody who's saying, I want to empower the voices of the Peruvian people to answer these social questions. And to give you a clue as to what that will mean in practice, you should look at the coalition that has been built. It has brought in a lot of leaders from different communities, LGBTQ communities in particular, right? As well, and this just has been completely overshadowed, the indigenous people of Peru as well, holding very important roles in this movement. I just think that at this point, it's very clear that this is something that is not only a good result, it's something that we should celebrate. There's going to be a long road ahead. State power is a lot more difficult. It's much more difficult to implement socialism, to combat the forces of imperialism and capitalism, than it is to campaign against them, right? These are very serious challenges, and we'll see how well these movements actually hold up. But this is a moment that we can clearly celebrate and have a lot of optimism about, as well as looking to it as a very exciting model of how to engage people in politics, like not in that kind of stupid, U.S. like high school way, like engage people in the civic process. Make people think that politics is a venue, an arena where they can change their lives. Help people understand that politics is a vehicle that they can use to improve their community, to improve their class. This is something that is very exciting. We don't know where it's going to end up, but it's something that is a very exciting opportunity, not only because of what looks as of now on Tuesday at 4 Central, as a victory for Castillo, but also as as a model of what it looks like when you bring in this kind of new energy into politics, which has brought in all these rural and working class folks who have very much been forgotten. And I just wanted to say, I think I have some questions to get to those in just one second. Just as a bow on this, I wanted to say I was very, very proud. Proud might be the wrong word. I was very happy to see DSA's contribution there showing up, all the people who went and acted as election observers, who are still having to continue to ramp up the pressure. as Kiko Fujimori is claiming fraud and is trying to hope that an international class of right-wingers and wealthy people will try to derail democracy in the country. That fight's not over, and also obviously Progressive International. But I wanted to read just a quick thing from DSA's statement today, which I really liked. So this is DSA's statement that came out on June 8th. The Peruvian left has overcome a great obstacle to achieve this victory. A series of dictatorships sought to destroy any hope of political revolution in Peru in an attempt to subjugate the nation. These anti-democratic governments also sought to make Peru a neoliberal haven with the support of the United States, most famously during the dictator of Alberto Fujimori. Fuji Shock program. The CIA spent millions of dollars supporting the Fujimori's intelligence agency to prop up his brutal regime. The elite of Peru, including the media, fought tooth and nail to undermine and smear Pedro Castillo and the Peru Libre Party. Pedro Castillo's triumph against reactionary forces, however, demonstrates that the hope of radical change is alive and well in Peru. The coalition built by Peru Libre, including groups like Nuevo Peru, which we'll get to that in a second, trade unions and other working class organizations, is a testament to the unity of the Peruvian left, as well as an example we hope, this is DSA, we hope to emulate. We celebrate that all oppressed voices in Peru will now be heard as the left begins the process of ameliorating inequalities that have existed for decades and restoring power back into the hands of the Peruvian people. I think that's a phenomenal statement and is genuinely how I feel about the victory as well. So let's see. That is pretty fun. I want to get to some of these chat questions here, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about Peru if people have questions as well, and we have Mexico and stuff to get to too. But Sipsa, I hope I'm saying that right. David, the Fuck Elon tour is coming to Austin, put on by Bitcoiners. Looks like you got something in common. Love the channels and the channel and Ye Castillo. That's pretty fun. I haven't seen anything about that. That's like that's a dirty alliance between the left and the kind of like Bitcoin boys. That's pretty funny. Thanks so much, hella cool guy, for the super chat there. Here we go. Josh says, is there a danger of saying Latin American left can't be pro-LGBT? When Lula, Mujica, and even Chavez had strong LGBT rights positions, could a new constitution be part of expanding rights? Well, I don't think that the Latin American left can't be pro-LGBT. I think that would be the wrong read of what I'm saying, what other people are saying. What we're pushing back against is this kind of smear that has really dominated a lot of left coverage in English about Peru, about, Castillo's rise being some kind of example of, to use like American online terms, of like a red-brown alliance, right? Between like socially reactionary views and like progressive politics. What Castillo represents and his personal positions on these things represent that people are being elevated into left politics from communities that haven't traditionally held power, right? And when it comes to those questions about gay marriage in Peru, everything that we have gotten from Peru Libre, right, and from Pedro Castillo's campaign has indicated that nobody's rights are being thrown to the side. This is somebody's personal beliefs, because they're a Christian, right? I very much disagree with that. I very much don't prefer it to be this way. But the reason that we've been pushing back against this narrative, right, is because it's been used to paint a picture of what Peru Libre is and what Pedro Castillo's campaign is about. As I noted earlier, Castillo says that he wants these questions to be answered democratically, not by his own personal beliefs on these things. At the end of the day, it's not my favorite answer to that question, obviously. It's not my favorite position for somebody who we're supporting to be having. But I don't think that our role right now should be finger-wagging about that, especially when the context has become very clear that these questions aren't going to be sacrificed one way or the other, right? And the fact that Peru Libre has brought in to their coalition leaders of the LGBTQ movement, right? If this was a campaign where what Pedro Castillo was doing every day was, standing up on a soapbox and condemning the LGBT community, condemning, socially progressive values and things like that. If that was the crux and the soul of the campaign, then I don't think it would be something that we would be as happy about. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of people who have been trying to fit this movement into a kind of box as to what they expect and want politics to look like, instead of seeing that what's happening right now is an incredible opening for all of these victories, from working class victories to victories for queer liberation movements, right? This is the soil, this is the arena that we can now do it in, and those communities and representatives of those communities have been brought into this winning ticket, right? And I think that that's something that's extremely positive. And that's been the kind of crux, at least on my end and on this show's end, of the pushback against this thing. Not to sit here and say that we can't have pro-LGBT. I mean, I don't know if you were saying that about me or just in general. I would very much push back against anyone who thinks that you can't have pro-LGBTQ movements as part of the Latin American left. I think that would be an incredibly paternalistic and sick way to think about politics. But what I am trying to warn people about, specifically if you are consuming like English language media about this stuff, is that just like with Yaku Perez, there is an understanding that people, one, aren't going to be spending a lot of time looking into these races outside of those countries in particular, and also the Spanish-speaking world, so that you can have these completely funhouse mirror examples of what the politics and what the coalitions are looking like there, right? And I think people should be very worried, because the people who have really propagated this were people who thought that Lula, deserved to be, put into prison. They were people who thought that Evo Morales deserved to be couped. They were people who thought that Yaku Perez represented the true, working class movements. All of these things have been, shown now to any thinking person to be demonstrably false. And I just think that this was a big mistake when I saw this, it was frustrating coming off of all of those stories, thinking that some people have started to learn their lessons about how much of an effort there is to demonize left movements, especially working class movements in Latin America, how much there's an effort to demonize those in the Western press, that I've been getting very worried that it's just happening right again in front of our eyes. And to the second part of the question, Josh says, could a new constitution be part of expanding rights? I think absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, absolutely. And two, that's one thing that's been so funny about the right-wing freak out about Castilla has been that, like, oh my God, he's like he's an authoritarian in waiting. He wants, forgetting the fact that he's running against Fujimori. They're like, he's a dictator in waiting because he wants to rewrite the Constitution. It's like, look, I think one, people are too precious about those things, especially in the United States. But two, he's running on it. The guy runs around the country with a damn pencil in his hand saying that we're going to rewrite the Constitution and this is what we're going to use, right? So it's not some secret plot by Pedro and Peru Libre that they want to rewrite the Constitution. It's just the lazy way that a lot of these things get presented in the West. I don't know. I really appreciate the question, Josh. And also I wanted to say thank you to Magnus for the super chat as well. I don't know what SEK is. Is that, I'd be curious to know. M. Kufe says, USA can't speak on this. Democrats blamed the LGBTQ for not doing better in elections. Yeah, and I don't think that these things need to be baked into the cake of like kind of like a revitalized working class movement. It's certainly not baked into the cake across the border of the continent. And I think the way to deal with that then is like through actual dialogue and building coalitions, rather than sitting on the sidelines and being like, oh, well, we're going to condemn this incredible moment. This incredible moment in Peruvian history and in the history of South America, where not only do you have a leftist winning, but you have one who's propelled on underserved, forgotten, indigenous and rural working class. I mean, that's an exciting and incredible rupture in politics. And to sit on the sidelines of that, I think, is a huge mistake. I'm sorry, politics is complicated. The real world is complicated. And being able to build where we have common ground, and then to build spaces to, eradicate socially reactionary views or socially conservative views, that's the project of the left. That's why we do what we do. But we also have to understand the only way that we can do that is by being part of popular movements. And I think more and more folks are recognizing that. Let me see. It's thanks, Sune. It's Swedish. Hell yeah. Let me see, y'all. Want to make sure. Please be sure to jump in with questions. We've got Mexico and we got money and politics to talk about, because that's something that always gets me going. Let me see. Oh, it's pronounced cuff. Appreciate the correction there, friend. Josh is sorry for misunderstanding. Oh, I didn't take it in that sense. Sorry for misunderstanding, not accusing. I just saw tweets from people like Oli Vargas suggesting Castillo holds these stances because he's not urban. Yeah, I mean, Ollie's analysis is what it is, right? I can't speak to that. I mean, I think Ollie's a great reporter, but that kind of general sociological stuff, I don't know. I think, but the crux of what Ollie is saying there makes sense, right? Is that this, if you're doing kind of work in communities that are more rural and more religious, that means that they're not always going to mirror exactly what more cosmopolitan, urban lefties are saying. I don't think that means we have to accept it, right? And to say we're not going to challenge it or engage with it or question or anything like that. But I think that, understanding where these things come from and understanding what the role is, and I think that's been the biggest thing, is understanding what the role of that has been in Pedro Castillo's campaign, is the most important thing, right? Pedro Castillo was not running a campaign based on hate and exclusion. He was just being honest about what his personal beliefs were, and then he said, "Here's the limits that will have on my politics." I don't know, I think that is showing that there's progress and there's movement on these things. All of this stuff is always in movement, right? Christopher, thanks for the super chat. He says, thanks for the work. Why don't you warn me about the length of Marx's Capital? Just volume 1 is thick. Well, it's definitely a big book. I don't know. I feel like that reputation sort of preceded it, but I'm glad that you're taking the deep dive into it and let me know how it's going. Yeah, and I think thanks so much, Billy, for noting this too. It's we are still waiting for the final. I think the last I was able to look at it before jumping on here, we were about 2% left of the votes to count, and they're international votes, which also is no small factor, by the way, too, in the way that these things were being covered internationally. So we still are waiting to see, but I think it's abundantly clear that Pedro Castillo has won this election, and we're going to have to face a lot of nonsense and accusations about fraud from the right wing going forward. So this is by no sense a settled deal. But unless anyone else has anything they wanted to say or ask about Peru, I also wanted to do another. Actually, you know what? Let me share this real quick to just show why this is such an important rupture, too, because it really is giving an opportunity. Well, the different Cuff says, so you ever notice how low the bar is to be a conservative, but being a socialist requires a lot of reading? It's well, yeah, because one of these is actual political and historical and philosophical inclination, and one is just reaction. But I want to share this too, because I just think this is another important thing to remember, is that, this is in the context too of a revitalized left movement that is bringing a lot of people back into politics, bringing the working class and popular classes back into politics after a very, very damaging right-wing resurgence. This is Evo Morales being interviewed, or at least the video was posted by Kawashiwan News. And thanks so much to Ali and Camilla for all their work there.
Una enorme coincidencia con el hermano Pedro Castillo. Como estaba en tantos eventos internacionales, y apareció una foto con él. Se ha hecho tomar una foto conmigo. Bueno, me dijo, cuando conversamos telefónicamente, nos conocemos en tal evento, 2 o 3 veces saludamos. Qué coincidencia con el programa del hermano Pedro Castillo y el pueblo, sus movimientos sociales, el magisterio. Por ejemplo, la Asamblea Constituyente, ¿no? Por ejemplo, la nacionalización de la minería, de los hidrocarburos, por ejemplo, políticas de austeridad, ¿no? Son coincidencias. Entonces las transformaciones no solamente están por una cuestión de reivindicación social, sino por cambio estructural. Eso los dirigentes sindicales, los movimientos sociales deben mentalizar profundamente. Mientras no se respeta la dignidad y la soberanía, mientras no se respete la identidad y especialmente la diversidad, las sublevaciones van a continuar, ¿no? Y esto está pasando en toda Sudamérica, ¿no? Y por eso saludamos al hermano pueblo peruano.
Yeah, and I think at a certain point, when you're looking at these results and you're seeing people like Evo and LGBTQ leaders in Peru and Lula very proudly standing with Pedro Castillo, you should start to get a sense as to this is something that's extremely positive. So yeah, it's an incredible moment, and I think too, and as Evo very much understands, you have to have the popular movements, not just having people who are voting for you, but people who are engaged in the actual struggle of politics, because that's something that a lot of people, especially people with a more liberal understanding of government and the state, like they don't get that as long as you inherit a society where a significant amount of the resources and the power in that society is held by private interest, by capital, by the rich, the only way that you're going to be able to chop away at that successfully is with not just a commitment to like withstand coup attempts and lack of investment from the ruling class and things like that, right? Economic challenges that come anytime a left-wing government comes into power. But to actually challenge the rich, you're going to have not just people who are willing to withstand punishment, but are actually willing to actively change the conditions around them. That's a hard-ass thing to do. It's a really hard-ass thing to do. And I think more and more we're starting to see an understanding, which is a positive thing. The only way that we're going to be able to do this is to engage the working class, because like the way a lot of American leftists talk about the working class is like working class power is as like an electorate power, right? And it's very true that you have a lot of abilities there to win elections if you're able to activate working class voters, right? Because it's a majority. But the socialist case for that is much stronger than just saying, oh well, we'll be able to get this many votes forever, right? It's actually saying that we recognize that as workers, people have a material power in society that can be tapped and utilized to weaken the power that the rich and the owners, the class of asset owners in society, right? We can challenge them with prolonged struggle and activation of the working class, right? And that's what Evo's hitting at there, right? Is that you have to incorporate these movements. It's been a really, really exciting thing to see. Belfron asked me if I can recommend any Marxist anthropological works other than Engel's famous text. Thank you for the chat. I'm sorry, I don't have anything off the top of my head on that. but would be happy to to ask around and suggest to you after the fact if you send me a note. I'm always happy to ask people who have better suggestions than me on these things. Okay. Let me see. So this is going to be really critical, and this is a point that I'm going to make when talking about money and politics. Let me see. The thing the program I used to do this is not let me read all the questions, so I'm trying to open it up on another page. How would you respond to the idea that in these countries, I mean, I don't know if you mean like countries like Peru, the parties are just as bad as each other because corruption is so common. I have a friend from India who says this as well. I don't know. I mean, that's such a generalized statement. Corruption is certainly a problem. It's something that people very much consider, specifically in Peru, where there is a great example of that. But at a certain point, that can become a kind of self-enforcing, reinforcing belief, right? Because that's the kind of retreat from politics and any kind of political change or shift. Of course, I mean, you don't even need to look at countries like in South America. Look at the United States. We have two parties that are basically serve, for the most part, a similar function, at least in their relationship to capital and their relationship to trying to fight for working people. And when people say I can't tell the difference between them, I don't know if I want to vote. Like everyday people who say that all the time, it does get a little hard sometimes to get really worked up to people and tell them they need to vote one way or the other for either of those parties, because they do functionally. I mean, you're already seeing Joe Biden and all these people walking back from some of the more popular policies that the Democratic Party has ever put in. They're walking away from things that they should take as wins, which is the fact that some people have more money in their pocket right now because of the stimulus payments. They should be expanding them, but instead they're retreating from them, right? Like, at a certain point, it's like, okay, well, what's going on? I understand where that apathy comes from, but you have to, as socials, we have this actual, incredibly positive view of the world and the future and of ourselves as members of this class that we actually can shift. And I think, falling into such a place of despair because of the way that the current ruling parties operate is, you're giving them, you're basically just giving them, access to forever rule, right? This is a long fight. The parties obviously are a nightmare. There's no doubt about that. But we have to fight and try to do something different. I mean, this is what Pedro Castillo's win really represents in a lot of ways too. So let me see. And Autumn, hey Autumn, happy you're enjoying them too. People are recommending David Graeber. I like Graeber. I think he's good. I think, I don't know if I put him in the same kind of realm as Angles on these things, but definitely, that's a great place to look at. We got Steve bragging about how many tomatoes he's got. Man, y'all should see my tomato garden. I've been eating tomatoes every day for lunch. Really enjoying this. Let me see. Yeah, the mascot's a pencil on them because they're going to rewrite the Constitution, right? How awesome is that? Let me see. Yeah. Well, maybe we can do this. If we're going to talk about the question of corruption, maybe we can, we'll come back to Mexico in a little bit. But I want to make this point, which is the title of the video. The pictures of Boss Hogg, if y'all aren't familiar. The classic villain. It's about this question about politics and money in politics. And I wanted to sort of point out, in the same vein, and you should definitely check out if you haven't, the conversation that Matt and I had last night regarding Leo Panish's debate against these two conservatives. One, a complete Looney Tune libertarian, Ayn Rand kind of guy, and another just a despicable, run-of-the-mill, monstrous conservative on the question of socialism. And I want to talk about the question about money and politics because I know that this is really important to a lot of people, especially people who identify as progressive. And I don't want to diminish this as as an issue because obviously it is. It doesn't take too much thinking to recognize that politicians being able to essentially receive legalized bribery from the wealthiest people in the country as well as from corporations is absolutely absurd and it's undemocratic. There's no doubt about it. But I think that sometimes people can get wrapped up in this in a kind of like idealist way, that the reason politics in America are like this is because of this system of like legalized corruption or bribery. And I'm going to tell you right now that it's not that. The problem is not that there's money in politics, that somebody's walking up and is only considering, who's going to be funding their next campaign, as much as it reflects actual structural power that the rich and powerful have in democracy. So think about that in the U.S. context for a second. And then I also want you to maybe zoom out a little bit and think about it in countries where people talk about, extreme corruption. I mean, this is one of the things that you see, in Brazil in particular. There are whole like political organizations there that just functionally operate as entities to receive, funds and bribes, right? And why does that happen? Well, one, because Brazil is a much younger democracy, which is not an insult to them. It's just saying that they just haven't developed the same kind of legalized systems of corruption and bribery as we have in the United States, right? So these are two different examples of like two different countries, and there's obviously money in politics there, and it's obviously a problem, right? But why does this exist, and does this create the outcomes that you typically that a lot of progressives subscribe to it? I would say no. Why is that? Because you need to have an understanding of what the state is and what the ruling class is. And those things are not as lined up as a lot of folks consider them to be. A lot of American government and American politics is designed to distract us from the real challenges that we have in dealing with where power actually lies. And the answer as to where power actually lies is very simple. It's with the people who own everything. We live in a society that is a hyper-capital society, and that's not just like an orientation. We live in a society where the vast majority of the resources of the land, of the productive capacity, right, the things that we use to produce the goods and services that we need, are held by a few people relative to the population of the United States. Why is that important? Because that's very different from just money in the bank or wealth. That actually gives you structural power to control our access to, one, be able to produce as workers, right? I mean, think about this. You understand what a strike is, right? What is a lockout? A lockout is the opposite in a lot of ways. It's where a company is refusing to let people to come into work, right? That's them leveraging their power. What is a capital strike? A capital strike is when the super wealthy take their money out of an environment. A great example of that is in the United States. States, California, Texas, New York, they're all in competition with each other for business. They all want big corporations to come into their communities so that they can say, we've got this many jobs, right? Well, how do the businesses leverage that? They leverage that by having the state compete, all these different states compete against one another to deregulate as much as possible. And when a state doesn't do what the businesses want them to do, what happens? Those businesses and the super wealthy, they move out of that community, right? That is a capital strike or a capital flight. Capital strike is what Obama experienced in the very, very early period of his administration, right? Where you're seeing this massive financial crisis. Obama is trying to do this BS, half-assed structural change. But even to that, what you got from the super wealthy was a lack of investment. what was happening, if you actually were looking at what was happening in the economy when it came to people with lots of money, is they were holding on to their funds. That's called a capital strike. By refusing to invest into the production in society, you can create an economic crisis, right? And they use that to basically starve out Obama and the Democrats in the early part of Obama's administration. This is not a defense of those people, by the way, because they didn't utilize or leverage or wrestle with this class at all. In fact, they did everything that they could to be conciliatory to them as they were essentially trying to starve the country out to prevent the most mild reforms that were needed in that period of time, right? I bring these up because that's the fundamental structural power in society, and that's how they really utilize their muscles. So the money they give to a politician to run their congressional campaign in Arizona, right, is a small part of the way that they get their way in this society. Another example of this to think of it, is what happened in Argentina. I covered this a lot with Michael on TMBS, and it's still been ongoing. Which is when you had a left-wing government, center-left government comes into power and wants to do some kind of basic stimulus programs to make sure that people don't starve in the middle of the COVID pandemic. But what were they having to do? They were having to negotiate with international creditors who were basically saying, no, you have to pay our debts. You have to do these things. You have to do what we want you to do, right? They were saying, we don't care what the voters say. We don't care what democracy says. We're the people who have the money, and you're going to listen to us. That's an extremely overt example of that. And that's the kind of thing that can happen in countries in Argentina where it's like very easy to see. But that also happens in the United States. And the reason I bring this up is because I want people to understand this is where money in politics matters. It's not necessarily just like the overt legalized bribery that we have, which is our campaign finance system. It's the fact that as long as you have this amount of people who have private control of their resources, and you don't have political movements that are, one, articulating that this is where the power lies, challenging them, and preparing themselves to utilize our strength and our power to counteract them, right? We'll never get where we need to be. I get worried sometimes because, of course, I'm against this campaign finance system. But for a lot of people, that's where they realize there's a problem, and that's also where they think it ends. And this is not one of these things like, oh, some people know more than you, right? No, it's just saying we need to make sure that we're always pushing this kind of discourse and understanding further, because what we have to do is an incredibly huge task of undoing a powerful entrenched political class, as well as an even more powerful ruling class that controls the assets and they control the money, right? And if we don't start articulating who they are and how they use their power, we're going to be ineffective at challenging them. Because I see these kind of initiatives for like, oh, we're going to do progressive reforms in our election system, and we're going to get rid of money in politics, and like this is going to make democracy in America work again. I'm sorry to say that's not going to do it. That's not going to do it. The reason that we have such an overtly disgusting system like that is an example of just how much of their way the super wealthy, how the super wealthy have just gotten their way at an incredible rate in their society. So of course it's worth challenging, right? But if you think that the super excessive and egregious example of their power is like why there's a problem in our democracy, you're making a big mistake, because they would prefer to give up their ability to be able to just bribe politicians overtly, as long as they're able to maintain their right to extract incredible amounts of profit, and things of that nature. So these are just the kind of more structural points that I think are worth considering and sort of wrestling with. And I'm going to be curious what y'all have been saying to this as well. But if you fall into this trap of thinking that it's just because our campaign finance system in the United States is broken and that's why things are the way that they are, we're going to fall into a lot of we're basically going to create a movement that seems like it can achieve a lot and then will achieve very little, unfortunately. So let me see. There's some questions in here. Okay, well, we got some tomato chat going on. I'll jump into the tomato chat in a second. Let me see. Why do we as a society think it's a good idea, except politicians being paid so much? In your opinion, I think that this is what they're saying. I think the politicians should earn a wage relative to the average wage of their constituency. I don't think that that's the way to go. I understand the kind of populist feeling why we want that. I get it, but as an organizational platform, I don't think that's the way to go. Just because it makes it very difficult to recruit left candidates. If you're basically saying to do politics, you're going to have to drop this. You're going to have to lower your standard of living. I understand the idea is like, okay, we'll live as the people do, and I think that if politicians decide that they want to do that, they should be commended for it and respected for it. But it's important to let politicians be able to stand on their own 2 feet financially. Don't pay them insane amounts of money or anything like that. But the reason that you'd want to have at least like a decent wage for politicians is so that politics doesn't just become a game of the rich and powerful. State government is a great example of that. You want your representatives to be going to work and paying a lot of attention to the politics of the state and to their constituents and things like that. If you're paying them as little as like what they make, for example, in Texas, you're basically creating a situation where not only can only the rich play, right? Because only the rich people can dedicate the time that's needed to do politics and to participate as a representative. Right. So it'd be very difficult for, a normal person to be able to be a politician if they don't have like a reasonable income for the work that they're doing. And 2, it creates this really nasty incentive where you want to do good with business because you know that in 6 years, you're probably not going to be in politics anymore. And, maybe they'll give me a job or maybe they'll give me a speaking gig or whatever. The more opportunity that you give for rich people to be able to, the rich and business interests to be able to make it worth politicians' while, I think is a dangerous thing, especially if we want to run political parties that are operating all across the country, right? A political party that's operating all across the country. It's going to take a lot of people and a lot of elected officials. And I think if we're just operating on this idea that everybody who's doing it is going to be completely immune from any temptation to make good with business interests, to make sure that they can, get a decent standard of living on the other side of it, I think it would be a mistake. Let me see. I do think that there should be a lot done when it comes to politicians' ability to speculate on the markets and things like that. I think there's a lot of stuff that you can do to challenge the pocketbooks of politicians and the super wealthy. But again, I don't think that that's like going to change the way that most politicians act. Because the most important thing is building a political party that is creating our own kind of organic members who are going into office rather than recruiting people in the kind of nonprofit political and legal world, as a lot of these things are being done right now. Yeah. William says, David, I'm looking forward to the bonus Parenti episode on JFK, on the JFK assassination. When do you roughly think that will come out? I don't know. Matt and I just sort of have that on the board, but if people are really interested in that, we can make that happen sooner for sure. Matthew says, this narrative that Castillo is some extreme social reactionary is so annoying and demonstrates the identitarian obsessions of a certain set of leftists. I'm a gay Latino and support Castillo 1000%. Yeah, I think you can see that, these things are being targeted for a very certain group of people, and I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush because it can get inaccurate, obviously. But I have seen a lot of people who were sort of wrestling with, oh, do I support Bernie Sanders or do I support Elizabeth Warren? Having a really difficult time with this Castillo thing, right? It honestly reminds me of when they were doing the stuff, oh, Bernie Sanders isn't woke enough. And I think it's like, God, let's learn a lesson on these things. Let me see, y'all. Anything JFK will get my money. Yeah, we might have to do that. Matt's a big JFK head. I'm in it for the ride. I'm interested to see what happens. So I'm down. Oh boy. I'm not going to read that on him. I love it though. Let me see. Talking about politics. Can we just really quick? I wanted to make sure that people are seeing. We're making sure we shout out what happened in Mexico. an incredible victory for AMLO and Morena across the board. It's been one of those weird, Twilight Zone things where the way this is getting covered as we already expected it. And people who are really interested in a deep dive on this, I highly suggest going back and watching our episode last week with Kurt Hackbrath on AMLO, on the election, on the way that it's being covered in the West. We very much. I want that on him. I very much suggest that because it was a really great conversation. I learned a lot from it. But it has been fun, and I'm sure everyone's happy to see that a lot of the things that were said then have been proven correct. People can also check. Damn it, I hate this so much. Can y'all not see me anymore? I don't know what this is. I'm using Streamlabs. If anyone knows about streaming things that are good for Apple products, let me know, because this Streamlabs stuff sort of drives me crazy. I was going to show, and I'll just read out the title and put it in the chat for people. Kurt has a good piece in Jacobin about the final results that I highly suggest. Oh, that's not it. That I highly suggest people check out. I just put it in the chat. It's also titled, if people are listening, AMLO's Morena wins the Mexican midterms. It was a huge. I'm back sound wise, right? Yeah. Okay, good. It was a huge victory for Morena, which is a very new political formation. As we talked about with Kurt, it's an interesting group. It's a very interesting grouping. There doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own contradictions too. Just like we talked about with Castillo, sometimes recruiting people to run for office for them, they've made some weird choices. But again, it's one of these things you can't even really have a real serious critical conversation about AMLO because it's very clear that the media right now is just willing to lie in the most insane way. And a great example of this has been how the victory for Morena in the most recent midterm elections over the weekend have been presented. And if people want to help Matt and I out, I think it'd be great to get articles basically misrepresenting what happened in Mexico over the weekend, and also freakouts from papers like The Economist over Pedro Castillo's hopefully looking likely a victory. But anyways, this was an insane election where you have the right wing and business interests really diving in. Kurt was talking about how there were actual vote buying schemes where opposing right wing candidates were handing out debit cards that were saying this will be filled with so much money if I win this election, right? Just insane stuff. You want to talk about corruption and threats to democracy. But no, it's AMLO who's in such trouble, despite the fact that his party, which in 2018 won 191 seats in the Chamber of Deputies, now looks like it's on track to win between 190 to 203 seats, according to Kurt in his piece in Jacobin. Additionally, when you factor in other left-wing parties that are in coalition with AMLO and Morena, it's a clear majority. They won. It was a smashing success. to take a term from our British friends. And not only in the lower house elections, but governor elections, local elections, people showed up and they selected that they want to continue the changes that AMLO has been pushing forward. And is everything perfect? No. Are there developments that need to happen? Absolutely. Are there serious questions about party formation and how to build a connected working class movement that's going to be able to outlast AMLO? Absolutely. But it's amazing to see the way that this is covered in the West. West is the wrong word, right? In the United States, where AMLO very clearly had a good night on Sunday, and they're trying to make, oh my God, it's so terrible. For people who didn't watch the show last Thursday, check it out. But, we were having a good time talking about how everyone's like, oh, AMLO's destroying democracy because he's giving press conferences in the morning, right? He's giving press conferences himself where he's putting his own spin and perspectives on politics in Mexico. What a tragedy for democracy. I mean, it's a complete joke, especially if you consider what came before. So shout out there. Another great thing. So we're looking like we have good results all across the board. All right, y'all. William says, many I meet think the left equals Stalin. How do I counter? Well, I would just point out to the myriad of different left-wing political movements, including the ones that we're all parts of, that exist today, as a counter argument to that. I think it's important to recognize that. I mean, the quick line on this is it's just like bad conditions don't create good leaders. And in Stalin's case, you're having a very, very provable, consistent attempts by the United States, the international elite and the bourgeoisie, as well internally, the people who had lost all their power. Additionally, with the fact that the entire Western Europe and the United States were trying to undermine that system, along with the fact that you have an extremely fragmented political culture there. So of course it produces, monsters like Stalin. That's not an excuse or anything like that, but it's just like, that's what happened there. Charles says, FJD hog. I don't know what that is off the top of my head, my friend. Stalin was left-wing, just the center. Stalin wasn't left-wing, just the center, as somebody said in there. Let me see. Yeah, Champagne Communista says AMLO literally didn't even gloat about the victory. He said he was most happy about voter turnout because it's good for democracy. Yeah, I think that's absolutely on point. They think all left-wingers are like Stalin, authoritarians and waiting. I mean, I don't know. If somebody really thinks that, I would ask them what is frightening to them about working class people coming to power. I don't have a quick and easy way around that because I'm not in those conversations, so it's hard for me to to wrestle out what their situation or consideration is. But I also would say that actually, we did this last night, and people should definitely watch the conversation Matt and I had watching this Leo Panish debate. But Leo Panish actually had a phenomenal answer to the questions about democracy and socialism, right? Where the questioner, who was extremely hostile, was asking Leo Panish, where has democracy and socialism thrived compared to the capitalism and democracy? First, Leo Panish pushes back against that framing, one noting that capitalist dictatorships are all too common and are much more common than any kind of capitalist democracy. And two, because he has, the good Marxist historical view of politics, makes this argument that I think is really great, where he says, countries like the United States and the UK only have these traditions of free speech, of freedom of assembly, all these, democratic values that we like and should support, because of the socialist movement, because of the working class movement, not in spite of it. As I was saying with Matt, idealists, which if you're not familiar, it's like that's a philosophical position that you're like ideas create the world rather than material conditions creating the world. Think that the United States has the democracy it does because we have some really smart people who wrote some things down on a paper in 1781 or whatnot. Shit, I'm gonna get in trouble for that. Because some really smart people wrote down a constitution, right? Despite the fact that we all know that it's absurd to make that argument, just given the fact of the contradictions of American history, that you can't have a constitution, you can't have founding documents that say things like all men are created equal, where you have millions of people in bondage. You can't say that you have created a democracy where people aren't even able to vote unless they hold property in a society, right? All of the higher values and ideas of the U.S. Constitution are immediately shown to be inadequate in practice. And what actually puts weight behind those? What shifts this? Where does the change come from? Not because people were sitting down like, all right, I'm going to read this document again and I'm going to think about this harder. No, it came because working people across the country said, this is BS. We deserve the right to vote. This is horrible. We are not going to have slavery in our society. All of these victories came because people rose up and they challenged the system as it existed, right? And that historical tension, right? That tendency is rooted in the working class and a socialist vision, right? And I think it's really important to recognize that socialism is not like a model of policies as much as it is a social process of something different. Out of the ashes of this old order will spring about the new. So when somebody says something about, as this conversation started, about Stalin and that all leftists are authoritarians, point out the fact that all of the democratic traditions that we can aspire to and enjoy today come very, very clearly from the everyday people, from the working people. Yeah. Well, y'all, I think that's as good a place as any to note. Unless there's any more tomato chat, definitely make sure that you're watering those boys, that you're making sure that you're pruning them. That's the way that you're going to get a nice, healthy crop. And obviously give them all the support and love and sunshine that they need, and you will be chowing down on some beautiful homegrown tomatoes soon. I'll see you all on Thursday at 7 Central. Thanks so much, Champagne Comunista, for the chat there. I'll see you all Thursday at 7. Please consider supporting us on patreon.com/Left Reckoning. And as always, reach out with any questions that I might have missed or things that you're interested in. Always happy to hear from y'all.